Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another exciting edition of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Vaughn Smith, and this is our Cisco Cloud Fundamentals series for exam number 210-451. And in this episode, we're going to talk about the 5 characteristics of cloud computing. And here he is. He's back. It's Mr. Ronnie Wong. How are you?
I am doing fine, Vaughn. Once again, thank you for joining me as we now continue to take a look at some of the different characteristics, right? Even though I described them in the previous episode a little bit, I always tend to kind of over-explain when I really wanted to just list them out. But we want to take a look at it in a different way as well. We want to make sure that we get access to this. Because it's going to be incredibly, something that you're going to be tested on. So at least that, right, is the first thing. But also understanding this definition will help you as you actually go along, because then you'll understand the access model a little bit easier and a little bit better as we begin to dive into some of the technology as well. And
we had left off on the NIST definition of cloud computing, and you had picked out specific words within that definition. So we're just going to kind of look at those a little bit more in depth now.
Right, we really are, because it actually does require us to understand where it comes from and what we're actually taking a look at. So as we get started, let's go ahead and review the idea of the definition before we get started. I'm just using the NIST document itself as we do so, taking a look at the initial paragraph right here. And then you actually see that I've broken it down, and we're going to go over that first little section here of the 5 essential characteristics in this episode as well, okay? So remember that as we begin here, notice that the cloud computing model for enabling ubiquitous, convenient, on-demand network access to a shared pool of configurable computing resources that can be rapidly provisioned, released with minimal management effort or a service provider's interaction. When you start doing that, okay, all this is actually very important. Make sure you know this definition. I'm not going to tell you that they're going to get you word for word, but it's possible that they can actually go, all right, let's see if Ronnie really knows this definition. And they might change something, okay, that talks about the idea, especially like right here, okay, requires service interaction, service providers interaction, okay, requires, complete management or separate management. You can kind of see this idea, or is actually dedicated resources of computing, dedicated configurable resources that are out there. So that's just an idea of what we want to take a look at. But now notice that as we continue to move on, there are many different characteristics of cloud computing. We're going to focus in on the 5 that are listed right here inside of the actual NIST document itself. And even though I've described them a little bit in the previous episode, repeating them is not going to hurt you. It's actually going to help you to learn them a little bit better as well. But that's where we want to begin, Vaughn. And I'm going to kind of skip around because I like them in a different order than the way that they're actually listed here. So we're probably going to just skip around just a little bit, but we'll see how it goes. Okay. So when we first start off here, okay, we want to make sure that we understand, especially on the idea of on-demand self-service, okay, what essentially is happening here, okay? So we're going to take a look at this from the standpoint of what the actual focus is of this characteristic node, why is it actually important for what we want, and how it's different from the traditional IT models is what we really want to make sure the aspect of this is, okay? So when we talk about on-demand self-service, so Vaughn, if we break down that phrase, okay, on-demand, okay, let's talk about that, okay? And we've probably seen that particular term in just about everything in our society. So, Vaughn, when you see the idea of on-demand, what do you think that means?
Well, I always hear it with like my cable provider and everything. Like, hey, if you want a show, it's on demand. So I think it's actually named that.
Yeah.
I go to on demand, and then I can go through the different things that are ready to go. I don't have to wait for them to be like broadcasted on that day. It's already been done. It's right there. I go to it.
Yeah, so that's actually the clear definition that we can have. It is ready to go when we are, and that means we can demand it when we need it, and we can actually say, that we want it right now, and they'll actually provide for it at that point. So, Vaughn, if we now take that, okay, and we understand the idea here, and we move it over to the traditional aspect of the way that we would have to do IT, is once again, Vaughn, if you were actually going to be, the one that's actually needing services, so you talk to everybody and you realize something. We need to bring up a dedicated web server of some sort, okay? So Vaughn, traditionally what that would actually mean is if you don't have access to bring up the infrastructure, it means you need to make a request, okay, of someone to do so. Okay?
I'd have to order the machine or the parts. I'd have to maybe order the software that's not readily available for me, and that's going to take a couple days for it to be delivered, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so even if you didn't, you'd at least have to make a request of someone that could do that, right? So if you think about it, so if Vaughn, if you could do that, you'd save probably a good 2 or 3 days. But if you didn't, if you just said, oh, I'll just go to the IT department and request web server needed, okay? And then they'd make you list out all the definitions of everything that you need to provide for that. And then Vaughn, they'd make it go through an approval process, and then they'll actually send it back to you and go, Vaughn, does this look right on the spec list? So Vaughn, that might take, 2, 3, maybe 4, maybe a week before you actually know.
Oh, I was going to say months.
Maybe months. Yeah.
Depending, I mean, I know some places where I've worked, I mean, just something very simple like that, because it has to bounce through so many different departments.
Yeah.
We'll go with months.
Yeah. So it could take months, right? But Vaughn, all of a sudden they come back, and go, no, we can't put that in there. So now they make you resubmit the request because they go, no, we don't use that particular vendor. Can you spec it out with this instead? So now Vaughn has to do it again and again. So now all of a sudden the fulfillment takes longer than what she expected. She may actually have to go ahead and maybe even consult with somebody else to say, hey, here's what I need to do. Can you help me spec this thing out? Make sure that we get what we actually need to as well. And then Vaughn, for most IT professionals, that means that they actually have to do interaction. And you know that at some times, not all the time, okay, sometimes that can be more challenging as you go, hey, I really need this, and go, okay, and then you never hear from them again, okay? So the challenge is actually right there, and that particular aspect of traditional IT, in terms of doing something like that, flies in the face of what cloud computing said, right? On-demand self-service. So the second part, Vaughn, is that other one. Self-service means what? You get to do it on your own, right? Yeah. You don't need Ronnie over at IT to make sure you approve that. You need to actually be able to do it. Now, of course, when I say that, this actually opens up a weird door, though, Vaughn, okay? There is actually a term that's called shadow IT. Have you heard about that term before? Shadow IT?
Yes.
Okay. So shadow IT happens in this way, and it's something that can be really bad, okay? Traditional IT environment that normally has to go through all this approval process, but Vaughn, you can bypass that by simply going, I'll just open up a cloud account, and I'll just set up my own server in the background, and then people start redirecting all their stuff to your web server, and it never got approved. So essentially, you actually ended up bringing up a whole other shadow IT department just by yourself here, and that can be bad as well, okay? So even though on-demand self-service is a really good idea, it also still needs to happen within the security policies and confines of what your network provider says or what your network IT guy says.
You know, I've always heard that. I never actually knew what shadow IT meant. So you're saying somebody's like kind of shadowing over what you've already set up, so it casts a shadow and kind of messes things up. That's the idea.
Or it works in the background, right? The very fact is, it's like when somebody says, they come to me and go, hey, Ronnie, thanks for setting up that web server. And I go, what web server? And they show me, I'm like, I didn't set that up. So now, Vaughn, you're the one that's actually set that up, and you have essentially bypassed all the security policies that I had set up here. So it can be kind of a downfall if we're not careful, because you essentially set up your own IT department working in the background and working over the security policies because maybe you didn't implement, which I can't say, the actual policies that needed to be in terms of security, or you didn't go through the proper channels so that they could recognize it. So it can be a danger. I'm not going to tell you that it's just always good, but it's good in terms of us needing to get things done that we can do it.
Yeah, this is maybe one of the drawbacks for having the on-demand self-service is because kind of anyone can do it in a sense, and it could, not be a good thing.
Yeah, so that's why you have to limit the idea with permissions and stuff, and of course, who can actually do this kind of thing. If they're willing to pay for it on their own, that's fine, but our corporate resources shouldn't be used unless they're authorized to be used here, okay? So what is the focus of something like this for the cloud, right? Well, what it's actually about is the idea of something that's fairly simple, right? So as a cloud provider and as Vaughn's actually using that cloud technology, she can actually implement on her own, which is great or maybe bad depending on what we need. But it's about the idea of being able to provision and deprovision resources. That's the whole focus, okay? So if Vaughn needs it, she can actually say, hey, do you mind if I go ahead and do that? And I go, sure, go ahead and provision it. And she can go into the web portal and do that. When she's done, especially if it's something temporary, Vaughn doesn't have to make the request, and then 3 months later, I'm actually trying to figure out, or she's trying to go, oh yeah, I forgot to turn that service off. She can simply, at the end of that time period here, just simply disable that service or get rid of the server, and she's ready to go as well, okay? That on-demand self-service portal is actually really easy because it bypasses a lot of the actual kind of traditional idea that it takes a ton of time to do what we actually need here, okay? So it's actually a great thing, but it can also be a dangerous thing at the same time too, all right? All right, so I'm going to scroll down here because I want to kind of jump around a little bit, and we're going to talk about this idea of rapid elasticity. Now, this is something that we really have to understand that within the traditional IT environment role here, okay? It's a process, and it can be hurried, but not very easily as we start doing it. Now, the reason why you might not be able to do it is if there's a partnering organization that you have, and that partnering organization says, look, if you change this, we're going to be kind of blown out of the water. We're not going to be able to do this. So all of a sudden, you're kind of limited in that aspect as well, especially if you're actually having to partner with somebody else too, okay? The other thing, though, is once you actually have that understanding here that you can't change a lot, because what if you change something and it really does actually cause so many other changes inside of your network that now all of a sudden you can't remember all the changes that need to actually be put back when it didn't work. Now, Vaughn, if you've never had that happen, it's pretty cool, okay? But I've actually done it where I said, all right, that's fine, I'll implement this change for a short period of time, and I did that, and it changed, and nobody noticed it for a couple of days until a couple of days later, and I didn't remember exactly like the 4 or 5 or 6 different changes I made. And now, how do I get that back to the previous state that I did? Not very easily, okay? Rapid elasticity does tell us that it can actually be provisioned and released here, and the goal and idea is what we call rapid scalability, okay? So remember that the idea of scaling something helps us to be able to say, hey, look, I need to scale down what I have. The existing infrastructure I have is just too much, okay? We've kind of reduced our particular numbers that we need, so can I actually put that onto a smaller server? Well, on a traditional IT, I might go, well, if I had another server, you could, but Vaughn, you wanted this big, beefy server, we're just going to run it the way that it is. And then Vaughn's actually going, well, I don't need it, but sure, I'll run it as it is. And that continues to again, cost more money.
Yeah, it's wasted space, if you want to say.
Yeah, it pretty much is the idea of some type of wasted output of some sort that we have to think about as well. So in the realm of cloud computing, you can go in and you can deprovision if you need to very quickly. And of course, you can actually provision more as you need to, but this time without the idea that it all has to be set up. Inside of clouds, a lot of times like AWS, you can actually provision one with templates, okay? And say, all right, it's already going to be set up, and then you just go in and you configure it afterwards. So that's the idea of rapid elasticity.
It's almost like a dial. You can turn the dial down, turn the dial up, and it just automatically does it.
Right. Yeah, and that's really important because the more that you use, right, in terms of cloud, the more you're going to pay. So if you can actually go, look, I can save, let's say $1,500 this year if I simply went to a smaller instance of that particular machine. But you couldn't do that in a regular environment, right? You bought the server, Vaughn, you're paying for that server, you know, and even if you only use 1/10 of it, you're still going to pay for the whole thing. In the cloud, you can simply go, I need this server for this amount of time. And Vaughn, you can spin up some huge servers in the cloud environment, you know, stuff that has like 64 gigs of RAM or even greater, and, you know, something like 24, well, not say 24, let's say 16 cores on your CPU, and you might only run that for an hour, but it might cost you, let's say $70 to run it for an hour, but that's only $70, Vaughn. If you were to buy a server like that, it might cost you in the thousands of dollars, and Vaughn says, I only need it for a week. Well, all of a sudden you're like, oh, you know, was that really worth it? But with the idea of rapid elasticity, though, it can really help us to focus in on what we need to do as well. Okay. All right. Now let's go back and, well, like I said, I'm kind of skipping around a little bit. Let's talk about this idea of resource pooling as well. Okay. Now, resource pooling is an important part of what we have because it really does combine together a couple of different things for us too. Okay. In terms of resource pooling, remember that this is the idea that most of the cloud itself, okay, it doesn't have to be where it's a dedicated cost to a single customer, okay? Now, can it be? Yes. Vaughn can say, hey, I want the cloud, but on the machines that I want to run on, I want them to only be dedicated to me and me only. And you hear about this as being what we call the bare metal cloud, okay? And that is when they actually take a server and they go, all right, all of Vaughn's machines, virtual machines and everything, they're going to only run on this one server. She's not sharing the resource pool with anybody. She's going to pay a higher premium cost for that, okay, which is fine. But if she wants to reduce the cost, if you think about it, the more customers that cloud provider has, they can actually say, hey, it doesn't cost you that much because you're sharing this resource with other people or other tenants, but you're actually kept separate because of the way that the networking ends up working here. So it can really help by actually being able to share that out for you, okay, so that you don't need more of it, okay? You can't do that in the traditional IT environment very well, okay? So in traditional IT environment, you buy the actual equipment itself. Can you actually end up doing tenancy if you want to? Yes. But remember, this is now becoming more complicated as you do so. The cloud's already separated it out. You might as well use that technology too. So that's an essential part of what we have. So the focus here on resource pooling is about what we call multi-tenancy, is what this one's actually about here, okay? So it's not a ton different than what you can do with the traditional hardware that you have, but in the traditional space, you normally don't buy hardware to be shared with anybody unless you might be in a building where you go, look, we're providing the IT services for everyone, and yes, I can actually pull together and do that, and you can, but then you're actually going to do something like what we're talking about a little bit later as we run through our course too, okay? We also want to take a look at this idea of measured services, okay? So this one is that you're only paying for what you actually end up using, okay? So when you talk about that aspect, that means you don't buy the whole thing up front. You're only paying for what you use. So I compare this to a couple of different things, and it always revolves food, Vaughn, for me, okay? Overall, I pay for what I eat. So in that sense, I can do this a la carte if I want to, okay? So in that particular sense, I buy it, I take it home, and I consume the whole thing if I want to, okay? I can do that. Or I can go to the buffet and I can eat as little as I want to, or I can eat as much as I want to, okay? But the contrast that is, of course, in the cloud environment, where if you only actually need a little bit, you're only going to pay for a little bit. If you don't need that server to be 24 hours a day for 7 days a week, you don't have to pay for that. You can actually say, hey, I need it to be off during these times. You don't pay for the time when it's off.
This might be dating myself, but this reminds me of when I was in college and in the dorm, you could call long distance. This is back when you actually had to pay for long distance. Right. And some people would have $0 for long distance because they chose, like, I'm not going to call my parents or my friends back home or whatever. The first month, what I did is I was just like, I just called away. Yeah. And then I got my first long distance bill of a lot of money and I got in trouble. And because I decided I was going to use long distance calling while other people didn't. So.
Yeah, it's amazing how all this can actually end up working out because it is cumulative. We don't realize something like this because it is, I don't want to say it's deceptive in the way that cloud services charge because they spell it all out for you, but it's fairly complicated in how they spell it out. That's the part that actually has to be there.
Yeah, and I mean, I knew they said it was, 10 cents a minute or whatever what it was back in the day. And it's like, because you don't really see it up front.
Right.
I'm not paying for it right away. So I was like, I'm just going to call, and I called a lot. And then I got it, and I was like, okay, guess what? I'm not going to be calling anybody after this one.
Yeah, a lot of times on services like these, especially in the cloud, you normally either get like a per hour charge, or if you're doing storage, it's a per gigabyte or per terabyte charge. So it can actually kind of add up if you're not careful about how much you're actually using in terms of the service. But the neat thing is you're not actually saying, hey, Vaughn, just go ahead and lay down $5,000 and, if you don't use it all, I'll take it. So it's sort of like our cell phone idea, yeah.
But it also kind of ties into the elasticity of like, okay, well, we can turn it up for a little bit and then I use that for a while and then I can dial back and then not have to use it as much.
Right. Yeah, all that's actually very important for everything that we're talking about. So that definition of what we're doing here is actually key, okay? Now, let's go back to this idea of broad network access. This is probably the most generic term that we see here, and it's exactly like what I was trying to describe in a previous episode as well. Capabilities are available over the network and access through standard mechanisms that promote use by heterogeneous thin or thick client platforms, okay? Well, what do they mean by that? Yeah, exactly.
That definition kind of just has more words in it than I really want to.
The nice thing is they actually kind of describe exactly what they mean here, right? So what we're saying is, Vaughn, if you needed to access so that you could do any of these other things here, okay, that we're talking about, okay, you could do it with your mobile phone. You could do it on a tablet if you want to. You could do it with a laptop. You can do it on a workstation. That's essentially what they mean here in terms of broad network access. It's about the device that you're on. You don't have to have a specialized or dedicated device to do so. You can actually get access to it as you need it.
Is that what they mean by thin or thick client platforms?
Yep.
That's just a term I I'm not really familiar. I mean, I know we had thin clients. Like, I don't know if that was the actual brand name, but the whole idea of like, it was like a tiny little box that we used instead of like actual workstations. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
So it's kind of the idea.
Yeah,
that
you can do it on that,
smaller.
or you can do it on just a regular workstation, or like the idea of your phone, right? The operating system is essentially built into the hardware right through the firmware that's on it. So that's a thick client because you can't separate that all out and make it work. But the thin client, you can. You can boot up your thin client, and then it just connects you over to wherever your server is, your terminal server, and that actually is where your desktop normally resides. So it doesn't matter what platform that you're on. So something like a tablet is actually quite key here because you're actually accessing it over, usually at least, like I said, a web type of client or a web portal of some sort.
Okay, so thick client is like the firm, like everything's built in. So my phone. So it's funny because to me, I would think that's like a thin because it's tiny.
Because it's tiny and thin.
Yeah. Okay, but you're talking. Okay, the separation of all of the components is more of what they're talking about with this thick client.
Right. Yeah. It's all combined because you can't make it actually work without that. So it doesn't matter which particular environment that you're actually in. Okay. Now, once you actually start doing this, right, the focus here, again, regardless of which device that you're on, you can still manage it. You can still do the actual web platform that you actually need to get access to the cloud computing as well, okay? All of these are actually part of understanding those characteristics that you need to understand, okay? Now, when we start to take a look at this, if we go back to my screen for just a moment here, okay, all 5 of these particular characteristics, well, Cisco adds in one more, which is that idea of multi-tenancy that I talked about, okay? So when you start to talk about that idea of multi-tenancy here, okay, that is kind of a key term that we want to make sure that we do understand as well, and make sure I'm telling you the right one here, that it actually is underneath resource pooling. Got to make sure I was like, oh, there it is. Yeah, see, there it is. Multi-tenant model here, okay? So you might hear that as another term for resource, pooling here, but make sure you understand that. Cisco specifically calls that out. And if they do, Vaughn, I'm going to actually suggest that you understand and link those two together, okay? That when they talk about resource pooling, the emphasis here or the focus here is on what multi-tenancy is what we're talking about, okay? The idea that self-service, the provisioning and deprovisioning. Rapid elasticity is about scalability, right? Whether you're scaling down, whether you're scaling up, scaling out, whatever it might be. Measured service, pay as you go, kind of makes a little bit of sense here. And of course, the broad network access. So it's just in my mind, I actually place them in these different orders. And that's why I wanted to review them in that same way as well. Okay. So all these are actually very important in terms of the characteristics that we have to actually think about when we start to deal with this, because you actually see that separation there and understanding what those 5 particular characteristics are. Probably going to be heavily tested on the exam. I'm not going to tell you that there's going to be 40 questions on it. Okay. But expect a question or two on this stuff, and don't think, oh, I'll just, be able to remember this. You make sure that you go over these definitions and these characteristics so that they become at least knowledgeable to you if you're given a scenario, right? As you go in and say, hey, which of the following is about provisioning and deprovisioning, okay? You need to know which one that it actually relates to in terms of the characteristics, okay? So if you don't know, you got to kind of pay a little bit more attention. So pay attention to the focus, pay attention to the idea here that cloud, as far as the way that we treat it in the cloud versus the way that we treat it in terms of the traditional IT models here. It's going to be very important that we understand that as we continue to move forward. But at least for now, Vaughn, we've gone over those 5 essential characteristics that we find from the actual cloud definition that's there that helps us describe that access model a little bit better. And that means we're ready to move on to some more of our show, but this is a great place for us to end.
All right, so keywords and all of those different definitions of the characteristics, because it's good test material. They always like to get you on one of those things. So thank you so much, Ronnie, and thank you for joining us. But we are going to go ahead and sign off for IT Pro TV. I've been your host, Vaughn Smith.
Now I'm Ronnie Wong.
We will see you soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.